part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
And welcome to another edition of the Reg Guy and Rhoda podcast, brought to you by MGM Northfieldpark, right here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Shout out to our esteemed producer, Dave Emmert, who makes sure everything sounds good for you in the podcastosphere. And Michael Regai, we are thrilled to welcome to the R&R podcast, longtime sports columnist at Cleveland.com, the Plain Dealer, author of more than 30 books, including his fifth one on the Cleveland Browns, which is out now, called Vintage Browns. Terry Pluto joins us on the R&R podcast. How are you, Terry?
I am well, Kenny.
Great to have you, Terry.
Reg, how about this guy, huh? This guy did over 30 books, right?
One of my all-time favorites. And, the thing that has impressed me most about Terry as he's gone through his career is now we know him, and some of the younger folks who know him, of course, as a columnist. But Terry was a long-time beat writer in both Major League Baseball with the Indians and the Baltimore Orioles, and also in the NBA with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So he has touched on that, and maybe I'd like him to discuss that. Well, I'll ask him a few things about that, because there's a strong difference there. Now, you're a beat writer, and now, of course, as was said, we know him as the preeminent columnist here in town. So we'll get into that too, but Terry's covered it all. So, Mr. Pluto, right there, my respect for you has been enormous down through the years, because you have found a way to, I think, capture that in grand fashion in both of those genres, which I don't think is easy for someone that's, been with teams and called play-by-play on the television side. It's a whole different world to me, as opposed to that covering a beat every day and now you being a columnist. But we'll get into that maybe a little bit later. Kenny, where do you want to start with Terry?
Well, I want to start for our listeners. The first time Terry and I met, I was coming out of Baldwin Wallace College, and we actually were playing basketball in the upper gymnasium of the Richfield Coliseum. Do you remember when we used to play pickup games, Terry, with Bob Price and Bob Zink, and all the media guys used to get together in that, I don't know what was the asbestos-filled gymnasium or whatever that thing was at the Coliseum?
Yeah, and that was the Cavs practice court, too. They didn't have, like, the Cleveland Clinic courts with everything that is, of course, sports science. I like how trainers became sports scientists, too. That's a nice thing. But yes, we used to play up there after they practiced. And the other thing that now I look back, it'd be absolutely scandalous, is sometimes some of the guys who weren't playing much, the regular NBA players, would ask us to join it because they wanted to run full court and they didn't have enough. So I remember playing in the backcourt with Steve Kerr, and all I was supposed to do was bring the ball up. He was learning to run around picks, catch and shoot. So that was like the whole game was kind of done like that. But there was stuff going on, and like a guy like Derek Chivas was playing, Winston Bennett, the guys at the end of the bench. And now I think back, what if one of them tripped over like clumsy me and like broken a foot or something? You don't want to be in your own story. But they didn't have enough guys. Now you have all these people hanging around the teams. They could probably have 50 guys, in terms of getting in that. And, Lenny Wilkins was the coach then, Wayne Embry, they knew that. They didn't care. So just don't hurt them. So the rule kind of was, if they went down the lane, well, first of all, you had to be an idiot to stand in front of them. You would get killed as it was. But you also didn't want to hurt them. But that was fun. That was a lot of fun, and the writers will play. And I mean, it was a different time. Practices were open, all kinds of stuff like that. So I do miss it, but I am so grateful because I was able to learn whether it was a basketball or baseball, especially basketball, just by watching practices, talking to the coaches or GM afterwards. And it was a much smaller world.
Yeah, it really was. Terry had a sweet running hook shot, Reg. I remember it to this day.
Is that right?
He'd get into the lane and he had a sweet running hook shot.
Didn't mean it went in. It just was sweet and it was running.
Yeah, well, it was his go-to move, and these are the things I remember from yesteryear when times were a lot different. But the great thing about Terry, and the reason I go back, is I mentioned over 30 books, different sports, different topics, different things. And his most latest pen to paper, or I guess, I don't know, computer to screen, whatever it is that he has out. It's called Vintage Browns, a warm look back at the Cleveland Browns of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and more. And Terry, how did this one come about to add to the resume of all your great sports books and other things that you've written?
Well, it came after I did a book first called Vintage Calves, which I liked. And actually, some of the stories about playing pickup ball with those guys is in that book. Unfortunately, that book came out, and about 2 or 3 months later, we hit the pandemic. And so we're trying to figure out how to revive it. It's a pretty good book. It's kind of like along the same lines as this one, but it just got lost. And one of the things I did write about there, we'll go to the Browns in a minute, but you just kind of stirred my memory, was World Be Free. My first year I covered the Cavaliers for the Beacon Journal. World was in his last year with the Cavs. And if you ever look up his stats from that year, he averaged like 23 points a game and shot almost 40% on 3-pointers. I mean, World Be Free would have been made for the modern NBA. Like, he would have been considered like conservative compared to how these guys just jacked up shots from everywhere. But he used to play 3-point horse with me after the practice. But he would give me all the letters except, HORSE. So he was already at R. I mean, I had to try to get S and E on him. And then when I couldn't do that, he said, all you got to do is get one letter on me. And I never could do it. Of course, I couldn't shoot. That was part of the problem. But when you watch that, everything had to be along the 3-point line. There were real shots. There was none of this, let's bounce it off the scoreboard. No, it was like, corner three, straight on, that kind of thing. And he was really working at it. And I realized now he was kind of ahead of his time, in that regard, because he kept saying, if you're good, you shoot more of these. Of course, one of his favorite lines to me, he said to me, real early on when I'm covering the Cavs that first year, he goes, you don't know how hard it is to get 20 in the NBA. I said, what, 20 points? He goes, no, get up 20 shots. And then so it was funny. He goes, now, I'm serious. I said, okay. He said, if you're on a bad team like I am, and they're running a couple of guys at you, it's hard to get up 20 shots.
Yeah.
Which is why I decided to keep shooting farther and farther out.
So Vintage Browns.
So that's a Vintage Cavs. That's a Vintage Cavs. Vintage Browns, as you said, Kenny, where you were very familiar. A lot of it has to do with the Browns of the 80s. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, you had a connection with them.
I did. I was a DJ at a nightclub in Middleburg Heights called Club Rio, Club Impact. It changed names, but there were 5 guys that owned it. One of them was Browns linebacker, the assassin, Eddie Johnson. And so every Thursday night, it was ladies' night, and about midnight every Thursday night, that close Browns team of the late 80s, Webstar, Slaughter, Bernie, Herman Fontenot, and all those guys, they would show up there, and they would come together as a group to the nightclub. And I got to know all of them, not in the locker room like most beat reporters do or reporters do, but I got to know them on a personal basis at the nightclub. And that's what was so unique about that team, is they did so much together, Terry.
Yes, and I think that goes back. It's just like right now, the current Cavs, people are talking about the Cavs of the 80s, of close feelings that fans had for them. Well, the same thing there with those players. Some of these guys are starting to make pretty decent money, but nothing like now. So they tended to live more in the neighborhoods rather than gated communities, or they were in your apartment complex, not in the penthouse. You did run into them, as you said, in the clubs or the restaurants and those places. And, they're playing at the old stadium, which people have fond memories of, but it was a terrible place to play. I mean, it really was. Nonetheless, it was their terrible place and our terrible place. And so actually the book began, I was looking for something in the off season to write. And I thought of all the hype and hoopla around draft day, the tuxedos from New York or wherever it is. And in fact, that year was going to be in Cleveland. And I thought, well, these guys that I grew up watching, and later on, I know the draft wasn't anything like that. So I just began making some calls to different people saying, what were you doing on draft day? And that began, in fact, one of the first people I called, Munch Bishop, mentioned me. He said, you ought to call Aaron Shea. He's got some funny story about it. I can't remember what it was, but, and he's relatively modern. So I started with him, and it turned out Shea ended up waiting to get drafted, and he ends up in the basement of his house. There was a power failure, and he was trying to get they had cell phones then. He's trying to get his cell phone to work in the corner, but the cell towers were out. And, but I mean, it's like he's waiting in his basement, a dark basement, for a call on draft day, not with a tuxedo on in New York. Or Deacon told one of the stories that he was another guy in the basement. I don't know if these guys all ended up in the basement, but they did. Deacon was another guy in the basement of his house in rural Illinois, Skeeter, Illinois. And he knew the draft was going on that day. But what he didn't know was, like, will they call or what? So Deacon's in his basement. He's waiting for the phone call to come. It comes. The Browns tell him, you've been drafted as a left tackle. He said, I'd never played tackle. I was a tight end at Illinois. I said, well, you're going to be a tackle with us. It was 5th round or whatever. So he said, okay. So he goes upstairs, and his mother's bridge club was there. And so he said to his mom, hey, Mom, I got drafted by the Cleveland Browns. I'm going to play pro football. Oh, honey, that's nice. And she looks at her friends, 2 clubs, and went back to the car game. And it was almost like, okay, now you're out of school. You got to go get a job, do this thing, and good luck. I hope you make it. And so, I remember Reggie Langhorne was sitting on his grandmother's porch waiting. I forgot whether his phone was out. They all had these weird stories of things like that. And that people began to really respond to those. And my publisher, David Gray, suggested, he goes, you really ought to let's just turn this into some kind of book. And one of the people that got real interested in it was Ernie Accorsi. And he was telling me a lot of the different stories about whether it's trading for Bernie and that. And Kevin Byrne was a big help because he had been through, all those Browns at that time. And so it really did become kind of writing a good stories of love. It's a football book with very little football in it. And the big theme was to reduce that team of the 80s to either Red Right 88, the drive, or the fumble, is to miss the story entirely. To outrageously diminish what those players did, what those teams did, what they meant to the community. I was really surprised when I talked to Bernie Kosar, where I guess we just all figured, Bernie was a superstar. He just knew he was going to come in and play well. He told me he was just scared to death his rookie season, because he said, I went out there and I'm thinking, I'm 21 years old. I'm 3 years away from playing at Youngstown Boardman, and I'm at the stadium. That's one of the problems. You play in your home team, and you're there where you watched them as a kid. It's like you feel the gravity of that a lot more. And so that ended up kind of being the theme of that the feelings of failure. And I went into all the machinations around the Browns finding a way to draft them. But he told me he didn't want to even leave Miami. He wanted to stay one more year because he thought they'd win a national title. But he really felt the economic pressure from his family. And then he said some of his friends were like, man, if you could get to the Browns, you could save it. It's like he was supposed to come in and save the city. And Michael and Kenny, you've both been around. Usually when that happens, this guy's going to save it. He's from there. What usually happens?
Doesn't never get close to that.
Yeah, it's just like this awful. It'd be like, actually, it was set up to be yet another awful Cleveland story, but it wasn't. So if the awful Cleveland story, the worst thing about Bernie was the driver, the fumble, and he was part of those teams. I mean, these folks need to go for a long walk around the block.
Yeah, Terry, I was intrigued too. I'm going to go back a few years before that, though. The Cardiac Kids in 1980. Because let's be honest, I think most of us felt like, hey, they're going to win a championship this year. Yeah. And that team, I thought, was extremely well equipped to do just that. And of course, and then the playoff game and the 14-12 loss to the Oakland Raiders, and it was so absolutely just deflating for the city and Browns fans the world over. What are your greatest remembrances from that? I kind of liked the anecdote you put in the book about the guy giving you the confetti. Almost 40 years later.
Yeah.
From the 80 season, the Cardiac Kids season?
Yeah, first of all, what helped me writing the book I was not close to those teams because in the early 80s, from 79 I did the Baltimore Orioles.
Right.
Then 80 through 84, I did the Indians for the Point Dealer. Then 85 through 93, I did the Cavaliers. So I was not covering the Browns. Sometimes I didn't even see the games because I was busy with other things.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was obviously aware of the stuff, and I'd run into those guys once in a while. I think I covered like 3 Browns games that whole period. I was trying to remember. This is kind of do an extra story. But later on, so I'm doing a talk at a library. Guy comes up to me. He has a baggie, holds it up, and he goes, "I want you to have this." I'm like, I hope there's not drugs in this, the prison ministry thing. They kept, a dime bag or what is it? What do we got going here? But I knew it was like weird. It was like red and brown kind of paper clippings, or I go, well, what is it? He goes, oh, it's confetti from the Red Right 88 game. Red Right, 1980 games, Red Right 88. Like, no, it's not. Yes, it is. And I'm thinking, who would make up this story? It must be true. So I said, he goes, well, after the game, I picked it up and I put them in several bags, a big bag, went home, put in little baggies. I give them to different people. So you hang on to this to when the Browns family win the Super Bowl. And he had written on there, I think, like Browns 30, Rams 28, 2021 Super Bowl or something like that.
Yeah, and too, I think you
what
pointed this out.
What does it say about Browns fans, Michael? Think about it.
Yes.
What does it say about them?
as absolutely locked in as any you're going to ever find, and just maniacal almost about their teams. But the thing
also
too
is a memory. But
great memory. Yeah,
a great memory of a game they lost.
Right.
But a story to tell. And
see,
that's the other thing that we miss. That a lot of sports is family and friends stories to tell over the generations. And I often think, now I had it, now for some Browns families are this way, like when I wrote a book called Our Tribe, the reason I picked that title was about my father and I going to Indians games, because to us, the Indians, like he would talk about Bob Fowler, Hal Trotsky, Joe Vosnick, all these guys from the 30s and 40s that he grew up with, like my Uncle Pat, Aunt Myron, and so on, all of them. Well, Browns fans are the same way. They, even if they didn't see Paul Brown, Otto Graham, there was probably somebody in their family talked about them, and they fit in with all the other relatives. So it isn't surprising that some guy's running around with a baggie of confetti from the Red Right 88 game. It just kind of fits.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, hold those thoughts right there. We got to get our first break in here on the Red Guy and Rhoda podcast, brought to you by MGM Northfieldpark on the Press Play Podcast Networks. And when we come back, more from author Terry Pluto joining us here on the R&R podcast.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. Listen, it is beyond time for you to join a book club. I know you've been thinking about it, and everyone's doing it. Here's how Books with Brooks works. We read one book a month, and then we talk about it. Classics like Stephen King's The Shining, debut novels like We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang, and tons of other compelling, life-changing stories, one book and 1 month at a time. So come read along with us and then listen in.
Hello, this is Don Mike Mendoza, the host of the Producing While Asian podcast. Join us to listen in on conversations with everyone who identify from producers to non-producers, who all are part of the AAPI community. There's all that and more on the Producing While Asian podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hi, my name is Sam Post, owner of Phenomwell CBD Store and PhenomwellCBD.com. That's like phenomenal, PhenomwellCBD.com. Tune in where we talk with experts about how the amazing hemp plant can make a difference for people's health and well-being from the Press Play Podcast Network.
We continue with the R&R podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network, brought to you by MGM Northfieldpark. And we're thrilled to have sports columnist at cleveland.com, the Plain Dealer, author of the latest book called Vintage Browns. Terry Pluto joining us, and Terry telling us great stories from yesteryear and what's in this book. And Michael, I know you have something you want to get out of Terry pertaining to the Browns of yesteryear.
Well, I love Terry's remembrances of, and of course, that turned into Red Right 88, that 80 season. Terry, I thought two very intriguing characters, the head football coach, Sam Rutigliano, and his quarterback, Brian Sipe. And I know you've got a couple of things, especially regarding Brian Sipe, that turned into to be quite interesting, even with Art Modell involved in it as well. Huh?
I mean, I wonder if Brian Sipe could actually happen in the modern NFL. Can you imagine a guy 2 years never even taken a snap,
right?
Then finally gets a chance to play and ends up winning an MVP? I mean, I guess you got Kurt Warner coming out of the grocery store or whatever, but where he was just kind of buried on the team, but they didn't let him go. They kept him. And then he led them to that. So, you know, he peaked there, but actually 80, 81, he starts to really take a beating. And after the 81 season, Kevin Byrne told me this story, and he's just a young PR guy. This is his first year with the Browns. And Art Modell invites Kevin Byrne and Sam over to his house. And Byrne gets there first, and remember the Browns, I think, went 5-11 after the year of
That's correct.
Red Right 88. So and it would really look like, you know, something was wrong with Brian. He wasn't throwing the ball the same way, that kind of thing. So Art Modell asks Kevin Byrne, says, well, what do you think of Brian Sipe? And Kevin said, I really didn't know Art that well. I just kind of started to go, well, you know, something looks like he's wrong with his arm. He's just kind of floating the ball down there. He goes, I swear I could throw some passes better than he did. You know, it was like a fan. Okay. So Art's listening and nodding. And about a half hour later, Sam shows up. And they have some preliminaries. And then Art says, you know, Sam, I was talking to Kevin right before you came about Brian Sipe. And Sam said, yes. And he said, you know what he told me? And Sam said, no. And he goes, this is going in a bad direction. You could feel it. He said, well, among other things, he thought there were some balls that Brian threw that Kevin thought he could have thrown about as well. And, you know, I tend to agree. And so Sam kind of clams up. Art leaves the room. Rutigliano says, let's go for a walk, Kevin. So they go on out. And he said, don't you realize this is what Art does? He tries to find people who agree with his opinion. And he says, and he'll use it against a coach or somebody.
Wow.
And he said, and Kevin said, oh my God, what did I just do? And he said, I learned then on, whenever they really ask an opinion, for one, they don't really care about your opinion. And besides, what opinion should a young PR guy have on the quarterback status? You know, and he says, secondly, it was an insight into, and he loves Art Modell. Remember, well, Kevin Byrne will defend Art Modell to death, but it was an insight into, you know, a weakness in Modell's character. And then he also learned, I better protect my coach from here on out. I'm not getting in the middle of that. And then the other story that Modell, this is a funny one too. When well, there are two having to do with Marty. Number one is when they decide to fire Sam, they bring. Of course, he told me this story. Ernie, of course, he wasn't GM just then. He was in the middle of being brought in as GM. So they go over to another thing at Modell's house. Modell brings Marty Schottenheimer over. Now they've already fired Sam. And
85.
Marty
this is 85.
Assistant. Well, Marty, we want you to be interim coach for the rest of the year, and then we'll talk about next year. Marty goes, hey, forget it. What do you mean forget it? Don't you want to be a head coach in the NFL? Not that way. And so now they already, and he said, well, if that's the case, let Sam finish the season. You could talk to me then like a real coach and give me a contract. And they're like, well, we already fired Sam. Says, well, you ain't not going to hire me unless you give me a 2-year contract. And so finally, Modell looked at Ernie, goes, what are you going to do? Ernie goes, I'm not coaching the team. So they ended up giving Marty actually bulled his way out of the interim thing into a real coaching contract.
Wow.
Which, by the way, which shows how smart he was, because that is the only way to survive. So now you fast forward 4 years later, 4.5 years later, and all the drive, the fumble, all that. And so it was last year there. I think they were 10-6. They went through 4 quarterbacks. Art Modell wants Marty to fire his brother as special teams coach and bring in an offensive coordinator. And he can't wait. Kevin Byrne and Corsi both told Art, will you just let Marty go on vacation? Let him decompress. Let's not have, no, we're going to do it now. No. And so then Marty gets word, and Kevin Byrne says, I called and says, Marty, just take your family, just go. He's not going to fire you on vacation. Just go. Let everybody cool off. No, I'm not taking anything from him. So basically they go in, they argue, and then they bring Kevin Byrne in. So there's 3 of them sitting there, and Marty said, and Art says, well, Marty's going to resign. And Marty says, no, Art's firing me. So Kevin says, well, what am I supposed to say? What happened here? So he goes, I'm not quitting. You got to fire me. And he said, well, I'm not firing you. You got to quit. So they just went around and around on the language forever. And it's like, Kevin Byrne goes, I'm offering, well, can't we just wait a while and try this again? No, we have to settle this right now. And that's how they lost Marty. Wow. They ended up saying he just left. They had 2 separate press conferences. Art had his and Marty had his. And then you go back, then you get into Bud Carson and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff about Marty Schottenheimer, and even more interesting stuff that's in the book Vintage Browns, and people can pick this up online, right, at Amazon and all the bookstores now. Yeah, Terry, is that where they can get it?
Has it. The Hornet Owl, terrypluto.com. There's a bunch of signed copies. I've signed over 1,500. I think of the signed copies, they've sold 1,300 of them. So there's a couple hundred I'd like to get rid of. I mean, I practiced my name enough.
So go to terrypluto.com to get the autographed copy of Vintage Browns about the 70s, 80s, 90s, and more. And speaking of the 90s, and I learned something. I thought I knew everything about Belichick and Bernie Kosar and the whole diminishing skills. Well, guess what, Michael Regai? I learned actually how that term came about. And who maybe is to blame for it or who gets credit for it. Terry, that story is in here about Belichick and Bernie amongst 2 or 3 chapters on those guys. Share a little bit of that with our listeners out there.
Well, Browns fans are familiar. And, Bernie was pretty beat up by his 3rd year with Belichick and the team, but still the team had a winning record. I think they were 4-2 or whatever it was. And all of a sudden after this game, Bernie had a couple times, not just once, but there was one where he totally disregarded Belichick's call and drew up, as he said, a play in the dirt, threw a touchdown pass to Michael Jackson. I think that was the year he was known as Michael Dyson. Remember that the one year
he was Michael Dyson? That's correct. Yes.
But he went back to Jackson. So
correct.
They decide to, the next day they call in Kevin Byrne. It's another one of these meetings with the coach, Modell, and Byrne. And so they look up and said, oh, we're cutting Bernie today. That's what Art said. And Byrne says, I look at Bill. Bill says, yeah, he's dividing the team against me. He's a cancer, all this kind of stuff. And Kevin says, do you really want to say that? And then Art says, we're not saying that. And Kevin said, well, what are we saying? And then Bill went into a long discussion of his arm strength and he's beat up and this and that. And Art said, he says to Art, well, what do you think? He goes, well, we could say that. I mean, everybody knows he's been taking a beating. And so Byrne says, well, what should we call it? And with a bunch of expletives, Bill goes, I don't know what you call it. Got to call it something. And so Kevin Byrne said, well, are you saying his skills are diminished? Yeah, diminished skills. So they go out, he drops that bomb in the press conference. Of course, that just aggravated everybody, all the Bernie lovers.
Right.
I mean, it was an idiotic move. Because it wasn't just that he wanted to play Vinny Testaverde. And Vinny at that point probably was a better quarterback than Bernie because he was healthier, younger. His body was younger anyway. But Vinny had just separated his shoulder.
Right.
Back then, by the way, when you separated your shoulder, they didn't play you. they rested you for a while.
Touche.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there. And so that was when the poor Todd Philcox in there like for a month. And of course, you lost the whole team. And it was just Bill being Bill. The other part that's kind of interesting, the reason there's 3 chapters on Belichick is one of the themes I went into is, had Bill stayed in Cleveland, would he become a great coach? And, I talked to some people in that, but really the Kosar thing was mishandled. And if you watch how then he handled Bledsoe later on when he replaced him with Brady, he learned from that. He did it differently.
Right.
Yep.
And then, but the other thing is he drafted 41 players in Cleveland. And I got this information from that wonderful book by Ian O'Connor, a huge biography of Belichick. Anyway, drafted 41 players. All right, Mr. Ray Guy, you're on the spot. How many of those 41 players made the Pro Bowl? Because I think I told Kenny.
2.
Yeah, I'll keep quiet. Go ahead, Reg.
2.
1.
1.
Eric Turner.
Just Eric Turner.
E.T., that's it.
You do not become a great coach with a drafting record like that. And by the way, he always talks about, the move messed up that last season, but they were struggling before that. He had already benched, remember, Bernie's gone. He had now benched Vinny and was playing Eric Zaire.
The Georgia Fire, Eric Zaire. That's right.
So in other words, he had become disgruntled with yet another quarterback. So now he's moved on from Bernie to Vinny to Eric Zaire.
When, if you remember that 95, Vinny started out 4-0, Terry and Kenny.
Yeah.
The Browns were 4-0 and then lost a Monday night game to Buffalo, I believe.
And things started to unravel.
It started to unravel there. But at the beginning of the year, the offense was humming.
Yeah.
They were 4-0. Testaverde was playing terrific, and it looked like, wow, this could end real nicely for the Browns. And it just completely fell apart.
Yeah. So I had this came partially from a discussion, a real casual one I had one day in spring training with the Indians, and Scott Pioli, who was friends with Shapiro and Antonetti and some of those guys, he just happened to be there. So I'm sitting with him, we're watching batting practice. And we got to talking about different things in Cleveland and this. And I said, well, tell me what happened. Did things change? Because I didn't at that time have the stat. I just remember them drafting guys like Craig Powell and all these other guys.
Yeah.
And he said, when Bill went back to Parcells, he said he then began to look at Cleveland. He took a very step back, hard, cold look at that. He said then when we went to New England, because he brought in Pioli, who was just a real gopher back in Cleveland. Now he brings him in basically to do the draft. He says, we realized we had a totally wrong approach to the draft. We were drafting all these guys we thought we could coach up, the guys from the combine, all that. He goes, no, we needed to get football players.
Yeah.
And you go back and look, Mike Vrabel, Julian Edelman, these kind of guys, you find a guy who can play football. This sounds sort of obvious, but these guys miss it sometimes. And you find a role for them. And of course, he hit on Tom Brady.
Yeah. And obviously that matters just a little bit, right? When you find that quarterback, right? What was it? Wynn, his first name, I forgot his name.
Spurgeon
Wynn. I started to say
Spurgeon Wynn.
He is in the natural gas business down in Texas. I interviewed him when I did the book Browns Blues. Wonderful man. Yes. I will say this. Here's another guy that used football well. While he was bouncing around the Browns, and then he was on the taxi squad somewhere else, then in Canada, he got his MBA.
Really?
Yeah, take that. So if you need a
Okay, there
job
you
in the
go.
oil and gas business,
Yes.
Yeah.
Look up Spurgeon Wynn.
I got his cell phone.
Okay, that's it. Maybe we'll give that out if somebody listening to this and wants the information. We'll see. But yeah, Tom Brady and 6th round pick, right,
Yeah.
Terry?
And that's what he always says. Everybody said, "Oh, we were so smart to take him." He goes, "How smart are you?" He goes, "We could have taken him. We had between him and one other guy in the 5th round, and we even waited another round and took him."
And for whatever reason, it worked out. The two, along with Josh
Yeah.
McDaniels as the offensive coordinator and some of the other guys that were, on his. And that's the thing, I guess, real quick before we get to a break here, guys, going back to when I guess Belichick used the Browns organization as his lab rats to learn what to do and what not to do, right? I look back at that now and I sit there and I see old footage of Belichick at a table with Nick Saban at the table. And these are the two greatest coaches in my lifetime in professional football and in college football. And they were on the Browns staff together. And to me, guys, I don't know about you, that's mind-boggling to me that they were both together in Cleveland, but didn't have the success there, but went on to be the greatest elsewhere.
No doubt about it, Kenny. I mean, also, look at the others on that staff, assistant coaches. Kirk Ferentz.
5
Who's
head
on that
coaches
staff? What's that, Terry?
5 head coaches on that
Five,
staff.
yes, 5
Fowler,
head coaches eventually on that staff. I mean, that's
Hill,
unheard
a guy
of
went to
now.
State somewhere, and
Yes, Pat Hill. That stuff's unheard of.
Yeah.
That'll never happen again.
Well,
and a lot
Ever.
of those guys had pretty good jobs in the front office. They tend to flame out,
Yeah.
but they did. But it's like anything else when you're younger. Bill was not ready. And also, of course, he's got some very interesting things about how Bill got hired and that kind of stuff. He had this big binder that just totally mesmerized Art and Pat Modell with. Like, this whole binder is going to save the Browns that he brought into, with all kinds of breakdowns of everything. You know how he's anal and meticulous at the same time. You could just imagine the binder. I could see it like coming into the back of a U-Haul. So, because it's like a couple of people told me, he came in the next day, Modell goes, "Oh, we got to hire Belichick. You got to see this binder." He had this binder. He had all this stuff in the binder.
Oh, that's great. All right, we're going to get a break in. We'll continue this conversation. Going to talk a little more Cavs with Terry Pluto as well here on the R&R podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Stay with us.
Hey everyone, it's JD from the Hyman Podcast. Backed by popular demand, I'm excited to let you know that new episodes of the Hyman Podcast will drop every other Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're going to continue the conversations we started last season and keep having those hard conversations. There is so much in store for you this season, and I'm excited to share it with you. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single moment. The Hyman Podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Looking for new insights on the Cleveland sports scene with a unique side of Cleveland sports history? Then you found the perfect podcast. I'm John Sable.
And I'm Scott Sable, and we're hosts of the Sable Brothers on the Baseline podcast, a podcast about Cleveland sports, but not your typical podcast about the land's sports teams. Join us as we embark on a journey of sharing a unique and historical side of Cleveland sports history with the help of some former Cleveland sports stars and other historical figures.
All right here on the Sable Brothers on the Baseline podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Want to hear more about your favorite TV shows and movies that are on countless streaming services?
Then listen to Up Next with your new favorite hosts, me, Kristen Aviles,
and me, Christina Walter.
Every other week, we'll highlight one genre, but 2 movies or TV shows, one old and one new.
We'll let you know what's hot and what's not from your favorite
or least favorite
streaming services.
And be sure to stay tuned to the end of each episode where we shout out an artist whose name you should know for their talent in the industry.
So follow us to stay up to date with your favorite hosts from Up Next,
a part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
And we continue with the Regi and Rhoda podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Thanks to our sponsor, MGM Northfieldpark. We appreciate them being on board with us for another year. And we're happy to have Terry Pluto with us as well on this edition of the R&R podcast. His latest book is out, Vintage Browns, a warm look back at the Cleveland Browns of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and more. And Terry, we've had a lot of fun talking about this book on my radio show at WHBC, the Kenny and JT show. Had you on there, and I've learned even more tonight with the R&R podcast in this book. Just your final thoughts on this and what you got from this, writing this book. Was there a favorite story or did something come out of this book that you didn't think would and surprised you, and then where people can get this?
Well, what really was nice for me, because I did not cover these guys, is I simply got a chance to know them. The only group, now I did put a couple guys that weren't kind of from the 80s, just because it's Vintage Browns, it's my book. Some guys I wanted to put in there. So Bill Glass, who was instrumental in me getting into to prison ministry. I think you'll find that that chapter really fascinating because he was Browns from the 60s. I picked, and also Ernie Green, because I had done a book called Brownstown 1964, so on that whole team. But I always thought Ernie Green's one of the most underrated players in Browns history, and I just put Bill Glass in there because I like him, and he was influential to me. And then also Phil Dawson. If you want to know about kicking, Phil Dawson just gets into great depth on kicking. Among other things, he says, nobody of these guys in the NFL know how to coach kickers because they weren't kickers. And then, and how they just sort of disdain for kickers. And of course, it just drives me nuts to this day how they let him walk in 2012, and they've had 9 different kickers since then.
I looked the other day, there was a story out and it listed all the kickers, and they're going to have to get a jersey like they did for the quarterbacks, right? When you were at 32, they're going to probably have a new one next year. So that'll be into double digits already with the kickers for the Browns. But again, terrypluto.com for signed copies of this, right, Terry?
Yes. And then all the Barnes & Noble should have it, Northeast Ohio. And a couple of independent bookstores like the Learned Owl and Hudson is a really good place. So, and Amazon has everything, you know that.
Yeah, without question. His 5th book on the Browns. So if you like the previous 4, add this to the collection. But the great thing with Terry is we can talk everything and anything, Reg. And we started the conversation a while back here on this podcast about how Terry and I met each other. And we did so with the Cavaliers when I was just getting out of Baldwin Wallace, and we were playing pickup basketball at the old Richfield Coliseum. So Terry, since we mentioned those teams, right, from the late 80s, early 90s, the Cavaliers right now, as we're taping this podcast, have the 3rd best record, not in the division, in the entire Eastern Conference, with a rookie and a 3rd-year guy kind of leading the way in Evan Mobley and Darius Garland. And some people are starting to reference this team, kind of reminding them of the Mark Price, Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance teams of the late 80s, early 90s. Your thoughts on that?
Now, I covered that whole group because I had the last year of George Karl and I had all 6 years of Lenny Wilkens. And if you break it down, Darius Garland is like a modern Mark Price, even from the way he's kind of thin and small. This would be like if Price were given the green light to fire away from 3-point land like Garland, you would have seen very similar to that. He might even be a slightly better passer than Price. But that kind of point guard who does supply a lot of scoring and is really the engine that makes it work. And especially after they lost Ron Harper, if you thought about like how they had Craig Elo at shooting guard, well, that's sort of similar to what they're doing with Isaac Okoro and Lamar Stevens. That big guard defensively to kind of protect Price in the backcourt, who doesn't need the ball. And so you see those two. Then you talk about size. Well, the Cavs, they weren't quite able to make it work, but they wanted it at one point to play Larry Nance, Hot Rod Williams, and Brad Daugherty together for the whole game. Lenny Wilkens just had problems with the small forward spot, so he ended up making Hot Rod Williams the 6th guy coming off the bench. But I think, Larry Nance Sr. was like 6'10", Hot Rod was like close to 7 foot, and Daugherty was 7 foot. So it was sort of the big three, like these big three.
Right.
So there are similarities. It's not a huge stretch. And they kind of came together as a group. Nance came in as a veteran that was brought in later. And by the way, just like Elo was brought in from the Mississippi Jets of the CBA. I mean, he was not, a high pick or anything. I think he had been with Houston or caught a couple times. Price was a second round pick at that point. Doherty was number 1 in the draft overall. Hot Rod was a second round pick. He came from the kind of the point shaving thing at Tulane and was exonerated from that. But the idea being they kind of came together at the same time and grew together. And, they were Michael Jordan away from winning a title.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the great Cleveland question. If they kept Ron Harper, would they have won a title or not? Joe Tate thought maybe they would have won one. The tough thing is nobody ever could beat Jordan.
Right.
That's the hard. Once Jordan got going, nobody could. And but nonetheless, you would have liked to see him play with Ron Harper and Craig Elo coming off the bench.
Sure.
That would have been nice.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And
then you roll with these guys. What do you think, Montclair and Kenny? I mean, think how they've just come together the last couple of years.
I love young Evan Mobley, Terry. This young man is elite, and what a tremendous get. I'm so glad they stuck to their guns because that wasn't the he wasn't the natural guy that the fan base wanted. And I'm so glad. I got a lot of respect and admiration for Kobe Altman, and I'm glad he stuck to his guns because Evan Mobley, I see this young man is going to be an elite talent in this league. He's got everything you need, and I think he's real good between the ears too, Terry. I think the young man's got quite a head in his shoulders and gets it and understands it at 21 years old. I'm just really enamored by the kid.
The interesting thing about this group, and it does fit a little bit too, with the Cavs from back then, most of them came from pretty strong family bases.
Mm-hmm.
And Evan's father coached him in AU. Then Evan's father's on the staff at USC. He's the son of a coach. And I think even though Evan was, I believe, the number 1 prospect in high school a couple of years ago, he was not allowed to get the huge big head that some of these kids get. Darius Garland's father's Winston Garland, who was a NBA player for 6 or 8 years. He went to a Christian prep school in Nashville where they lived, and then he went to Vanderbilt. In other words, even though he was highly regarded too as a high school player, the parents kept a kind of close eye on him.
Yeah, heavy emphasis on academics with him at Vanderbilt.
Academics and just kind of, we're not going to let you just go think you walk on water here. Mm-hmm. Jared Allen, I don't know a lot about his background, but you could just tell that, he's very solid. Colin Sexton, I met both of his parents, and his dad, his mother was, I believe, a social worker, and his dad, sold dental or medical supplies, very involved with him, and so we don't have Sexton now. And, Kevin Love has kind of been around, but I just think that it helps though, when you see these younger guys where they didn't come in utterly spoiled.
I was not a big Kobe Altman fan prior to this year. Yeah. I was of the belief and always am, show me, don't tell me, right? That the year-end press conference last year, I remember it, Kobe talking about, this will be the year where we maybe take a step forward. Yeah. And I brought up the Atlanta Hawks and the Phoenix Suns and how they moved forward through the lottery and everything like that. And he said, well, don't compare us to the Suns, compare us more to the Hawks. And I'm like, okay, well, show me. I don't know, had they had the first overall pick, if they would have taken Evan Mobley, they might have gone, Cunningham, they may have gone Green. Yeah. But, and I was a big Green guy. Let me say that first. I wanted Green, and then I wanted Mobley. Those were my top 2. So either one of those guys at 3, I would have been thrilled. Well, guess what? Kobe Altman didn't have to pick Mobley. He kind of fell into their lap. And boy, am I glad that he did, because I agree with Michael. Forget Chris Bosh. I'm looking more at AD, Anthony Davis, or with his fundamentals and his cool, calm demeanor, a little bit of Tim Duncan in him. I think he can be that good, and already defensively, he is, Terry. And then I've got to get credit for the Jared Allen trade. That was an outstanding move by Kobe Altman. The Darius Garland pick now in year 3, he should be an all-star this year. That looks like it was an outstanding pick. So, put some crow on my plate, put some Old Carolina barbecue classic sauce on that, and I'll gladly eat it because I'm enjoying the hell out of watching this Cavaliers team play.
The thing that I believe changed the whole trajectory of the franchise was the Jared Allen trade. And it was a gamble because they did give up a Milwaukee number 1 pick. Now, granted, not high, still first pick.
Right.
The guy is a restricted free agent. You could end up where somebody makes a huge offer and you're paying this guy $35 million a year, who knows what, to keep him. Well, nobody did make him an offer, at least of consequence. And they signed him 5 years for $100 million. Then you'd go and he drafts Mobley, who was number 1 on Bickerstaff's draft board. I don't know who was number 1 on Kobe's. He might have been number 2. It might have been Cunningham. But they had him 1 and 2. But I know for a fact he was number 1 on Bickerstaff. Because Bickerstaff, think about it, he likes big, he likes defense.
Sure.
So that just fits right there.
He learned from his daddy.
That's how. I mean, these guys do in some ways remind me of when he played those old Seattle teams where Bernie was coaching. Xavier McDaniel and Sigma and those guys. You hate Nate McMillan. You hated playing those guys.
Right.
Tough, physical, going to beat you up.
Yeah, they're going to beat you up, and so they were. So anyway, but it began with Allen, and then you go take Mobley, and it's a quiet trade. Mark Bartelstein, who was Larry Nance's agent, Larry Nance Jr.'s agent, quietly asked, Larry would really like to play in a playoff team because he just didn't see like the rest of us. He was beat down. This is it. And Larry had been having some injuries and thought, I don't have forever here. If he could trade him, because Kobe had turned down some offers for Larry Nance before. And he says, if it's the right team, so Kobe got in to make that deal for Larry Marketing. And I'm like,
yeah, me too.
Right. All 3 of us.
And I'm like,
never was a marketing
Larry.
guy.
I saw him play in high school. I wrote about him in high school at Revere, but he keeps getting hurt. But Larry Marketing, of course, now we see Marketing was a typical Cavs thing where he went through all these coaches and different theories, and you could tell he's almost an introverted kid from Finland. So that had to be difficult. So now you got the 3 big guys. Garland, I'm actually, this is like Mobley's such an exception. After having watched the NBA the last few years, I almost don't even count what a player does as a rookie because I expect him to be terrible. He's 19. He's with the big guys. It's really hard. And so you see what Mobley's doing. He looks like a 5-year pro. He looks like he's about 25, been playing the league 5 years and going to continue to get better. And then JB says, first of all, they did start the big 3 kind of early. Remember, Kobe actually preferred all the 3-pointers, the run and gun, the analytics stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they got smashed in those first 2 games. Go book and look. I think they get up 132 and 128.
Right.
Well, he sat down and said, enough of this. We're big. Why are we running up and down taking moronic shots?
Right.
Especially we don't have that many great shooters. So then they go and we're going to defend in that. And he was talking defense, but then they started playing at the same trash ball they had been playing in the past. And that's what I'm sorry. If you can't shoot a lot of 3-pointers very well, don't shoot them.
Right. It's simple.
It's that. By the way, do you know, and now this was as of a week ago, I haven't looked lately, but the team that was shooting the fewest 3-pointers in the NBA, it's not the Cavaliers, but it's one of the surprise teams. Think of a surprise team.
Chicago Bulls?
Yes.
Really?
And they also have one of the highest percentages of making.
They've shot the fewest threes?
Yes.
Well, think about it. Who they add? DeMar DeRozan, whose game is what? The mid-range game.
Mid-range game.
That's supposed to be terrible. That'll never work.
Right. Yeah. And they're 1 and the Cavs are 3 right now. Or no, it's as we're taping, Heat 1, Bulls 2, Cavs 3 right now in the Eastern Conference.
There
Go
you
figure,
are.
right?
And so, and there's a number of teams like the Bulls. I mean, the Bucks take a lot of threes. Golden State take a lot of threes.
Oh, yeah.
So it really depends. You play it to your talent, but you don't just shoot threes to shoot threes. And so they were able to convince Marketing that you will play small forward and not get embarrassed. We will help you, because he was worried about that.
Right.
Because, if you're on a bad team and you're 7 foot and you're out there, trying to guard some, even like you get stuck on DeRozan or somebody, you're going to get embarrassed.
Yeah.
And he said, well, first of all, we got a core we can put on different people to help you. And then said, secondly, you're going to have Jared Allen and Mobley. They'll have your back. Stay with he goes, then you got to have their back. If you lose your guy, go find somebody else and block them out. Yeah. So it worked. And the cool thing is now suddenly big men are sort of in again. Look what Embiid's doing and that.
The Joker in Denver, the MVP last year. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with taking, the old line is, well, 3 points are better than 2. And I wish I've stole this line from somebody else because I live ago, but 2 points are better than none.
Yeah, right. If you miss the long shot, you're better off with the 2 points.
And they use a fast break and a dunk down the other end for the other team. So.
Yeah, well, you know what? They're fun to watch. They're 30-19 through 49 games. And, it looks like this isn't going to fade. Like, the last couple of years, they got off to good starts and it didn't last. And, they made a coaching change and JB looks to be the right guy. Mobley looks like, he's the front runner for Rookie of the Year. Jared Allen and DG look like they could be playing February 20th in Cleveland at the All-Star game. So who'd have thunk that the Browns wouldn't make the playoffs, right, guys, in the 2021 season, and we'd be talking about the Cavaliers as a playoff team instead of the Browns.
And who's tough, smart, and accountable now?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. I'm going to crack open a nice cold Labatt and wash that crow down that I'm eating, but gladly doing so.
Now, if I were running this team, here's what would have happened.
What?
I would have taken Jalen Suggs over Mobley.
Oh, really?
And I'd have bought out Love.
Wow.
Okay. All right.
So, I would be, making a lot of calls for a job right now.
Are you surprised? Are you surprised at the Kevin Love buy-in and how he has certainly been a huge factor coming off the bench for this basketball team, Terry? I am a little bit. I didn't think he'd do it.
I'm shocked. I'm blown away as well, guys. All three of us, right?
Well, the two factors. Number one was this is actually what they hoped he would be. How he is with the young players now.
Yeah.
And that because there's part of Kevin that can do that. That always has been in him. The question is, would he do it?
You got to dig deep to get it out of him, though.
Would he stay healthy? Now, we got to give the sports scientists, I made fun of them earlier, but they went into all this stuff and they came up with the parameters of between 18 to 24 minutes a game off the bench for Kevin. So in other words, to have him give good energy in there, but because calf muscles, they studied calf muscles. Remember, he kept tearing the calf, pulling the calf muscles, pulling the calf muscles. That's serious. Remember Lonnie Chisenhall? He never could get that ended his career in the late 20s. He kept pulling one after another, both of them.
Terry,
get into a thing with
it's funny you bring that up because the Tommy John surgery was named after Tommy John on the Kenny and JT show. Whenever anybody pulls a calf muscle, we reference it as the Lonnie Chisenhall.
It is, and it doesn't sound bad, but it's serious business because it's done by your Achilles and all that. Well, I just thought, Kevin's going to run out there. He'll play 5 or 10 games, and he'll be out for 2 months. And then it's like, when is Kevin coming back? The same stuff. Right. The team will be losing. He'll get mad at the coach, with just all this stuff. But they actually figured a formula, and what they got to do is keep JB disciplined. Don't fall into trying to play him 30 minutes. Right. Don't do this. This is working. He hasn't gone this long in a season. But the only thing he missed, he was on the COVID list for like 10 days or whatever.
Right.
And it really, if once in a while he starts to feel something a little funky, stop right there.
Yep.
Let
it's
him
a
know.
50 game mark and he's still going. And I would have told you, no way, no chance.
Michael, and you guys, think about when you come off the bench, who are you playing against?
Right.
The other bench players.
Yeah.
From the opposition.
Kevin Love.
Right.
Raw
when healthy,
meat, baby.
Right.
Does all those pump fakes and all that.
And don't forget this factor too, guys. We haven't mentioned him, and I know we got to wrap things up, but the fact that they brought in an old teammate of his from Minnesota, Ricky Rubio, to play with him in that second unit that started this season, and it's a shame that Ricky tore his ACL. Right? That was big, and I think that might have helped Kevin buy into it even more. Right.
And also JB was on his first coaching staff at Minnesota. He was like, real down the food.
That's right.
He said, Kevin, and a lot of time that when you're a rookie, that real younger coach ends up a guy you gravitate to. So that's helped him. And as you listen to, I just think JB even when they weren't doing much, has given some of the best press conferences I've ever heard over the years. He's very interesting to listen to.
He learned very well from being in the league for so many years and having a dad as an NBA coach. And it's nice to not have to worry about the head coach, the general manager, and a team now that's moving in the right direction instead of constantly being another ping pong ball in the hopper team.
I wrote that. I'm so relieved not to think about ping pong balls.
Amen to that.
You guys remember this one?
Good.
Asset accumulation.
Yes.
Sounds like a disease too, by the way. But asset accumulation.
Wait, was that a Chris Grant term, Terry, or who was that?
Yeah, one of those from back there. But Kobe had that. He was accumulating assets too. And a lot of asset accumulation, not communication, accumulation.
Accumulation, right. Like it's slowing outside. Hey, Terry, this has been a lot of fun. Let's do this again somewhere down the road because we're just scratching the surface with you.
How about when the Cavs are going into that second round of the playoffs after they've won the opening series? We do it then.
Wow.
Hey, Terry, again, as Michael was saying there about the Cavaliers and the playoffs, let's do this again. And if you got another book to push, great. If not, we just love talking with you because you're a walking, talking encyclopedia of Cleveland sports. So thanks for making time for us tonight, and let's plan on doing this again down the road, all right?
I had a delightful time with both you guys, so you take care.
All right, sounds good. There he is, one of the best in the business, whether it's as a beat reporter, a columnist, or an author. Terry Pluto spending some time with us here on the Red Guy and Rhoda podcast. Hope you all enjoyed that. We'll be back with plenty more here in the year of 2022. We want to thank our sponsor once again, MGM Northfieldpark, for being on board with us once again here to bring you the R&R podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.